Glad you're here today. We worship Jesus. That's why we're here, to worship God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You know, dads become famous for saying certain kinds of lines, and I started sort of collecting them. If you've ever heard your dad say one of these, or if your dad's with you, you might even give him a little elbow if you've ever heard one of these. If he comes into the house after forgetting his keys, he may have said something like, "Can't get very far without these." Or after tying stuff down to the top of the car, he might have said, "That's not going anywhere." Or he's probably asked you, "When was the last time you changed the oil in your car?" Or before a trip, he may have said, "We've got to leave early to beat the rush." When you pull up to a familiar intersection, maybe your dad has said, "I remember when all of this used to be fields." Or if he sees traffic on the opposing side, he might say, "Glad we're not going that way." And then there's just some classic dad jokes that we roll our eyes with. You know, you see a cow lying down. "Look, ground beef." Or you drive past a cemetery and your dad may say, "People are just dying to get in there." Or he might say, "You know, the first French fries weren't actually cooked in France. They were cooked in Greece." Or maybe your dad said, "You know, I'm reading a book on anti-gravity and it is impossible to put down." What do you call somebody with no body and no nose? Nobody knows. Or the last one, maybe your dad has done this. When the cashier says, "Hey, would you like your milk in the bag?" He says, No, you can just leave it in the carton." So anyway, you just roll your eyes when you hear dad jokes. You know, I know what our kids are going to say someday when they hear me do dad jokes is they're going to say, "Geez, Johnny," because that's sort of become a phrase in our house. It really started driving. If I'd ever have to do like a sudden turn, I'm guessing my wife enough times has said, "Geez, Johnny," that the kids have picked up on it. And Bryce, I don't even think he knows my name is Johnny, but he knows there's certain moments when you say, "Geez, Johnny." And we were flying on an airplane once, and it was a really rough landing. The pilot just went boom, and it got really quiet on the plane, and Bryce goes, "Geez, Johnny." So I think when I tell dad jokes, when I have dad lines, "Geez, Johnny" is what's going to come. This summer, we are chasing wisdom through the book of Proverbs. And I thought, you know, since it's Father's Day, this is a great time to sort of pull over and say, okay, what does Proverbs have to say about parenting? And there's a lot. There's a lot that's said in here that we can sort of glean wisdom on parenting. You know who the best parents are? The ones who don't have kids yet, right? I'm afraid I was a lot like that. I had older sisters, had a lot of nieces and nephews. I thought I was going to be a really, really good parent. Those are usually the ones who think they've got it all figured out. But we could all use wisdom in this thing called parenting. Now, some of you in here are probably actively involved in the parenting process. Some might be grandparents, and depending where they live and your time availability, you may or may not have different levels of involvement with your grandkids. You might be a good friend. Maybe you don't have children, but you have friends who have kids. You might be married and expecting to have kids someday. There's just a wide spectrum of us that could benefit from the wisdom that Solomon has through God on this topic of parenting. So 2 disclaimers. There's no way we can get through all that Proverbs has to say on parenting. There's 54 Proverbs that have to do with parenting. So if we were to take one each week, we could be here for over a year. So we're not going to do that. Today is going to be a little bit more of a flyby of what's said. And then the second disclaimer is sort of like I said last week. I don't stand up here as the expert. In fact, very far from it. I think at one point I thought I was going to be a really good parent. I don't think that anymore. I have a lot to learn, as I'm sure we would all agree. So what is Proverbs going to teach us about parenting? Here's sort of the categories that I want us to talk about. I want us to talk about children. I want us to talk about what's the job of a parent, and then talk a little bit about the approach. I think these are the sort of categories it talks about. So let's first talk about children. You know, when we see each other's children, we're tempted to say things like, "Oh, isn't she cute?" or "Wow, he's a handsome little boy." Those are the kinds of things we say when we see each other's kids. Like, here's a picture of our youngest, Bryce. Like, what are you going to say when you see that picture, right? Yeah, you're going to say he's cute or whatever. He looks like his father, something. No, but Solomon is a lot more realistic than this. In fact, Solomon's favorite way to describe kids is foolish. He's rebellious. Now, it's fascinating. There are lots of words that Solomon could have used to talk about kids. He uses this one Hebrew term called na'ar. And if you look into that word, it's fascinating. The root of it is growling or crying or screaming. It's used to describe rivers that sort of gush, a river that's agitated. And that's how it describes our kids. There are these na'ars, these screaming, noisy, agitated ones. Solomon says they're foolish. Now, what does this mean? Let's look at one proverb. Proverbs 22:15. He says, folly is bound up, it's rooted, it's discovered in the heart of a child. You look at this word folly, and it really means a thick fluid. So think like Vaseline or peanut butter, or you know how you hold the ketchup bottle and you just wait. Think that's what this word folly means. That's what Solomon uses to describe these kids. He says they're foolish, they're stubborn, they're obstinate. One writer I read this week said, by nature they are oppositional. Now that's really interesting to think about, because most psychologists you'd read today, they would say, no, kids, they're like a blank slate. Write on them whatever you want to. And Solomon said, no. Don't believe that for a minute. In the heart of a child, if you really look, they are off-center. That's why I've entitled this message, Rebels in Waiting. Because that's how Solomon would describe them. They're stubborn. They're thick-headed. In fact, it's so bad that he describes them in Proverbs 29. He says, you know what happens if you just left a child to their own devices? Proverbs 29:15. He says, a child left undisciplined disgraces its mother. If you don't do anything, if you just take a child and don't have any influence on them at all, what would happen? Solomon says, it's not good. What would happen? In fact, most of us probably read a book about this growing up in school. A dozen or so English boys were left on a deserted island, had to sort of figure out things for themselves. How much would life be about them and how much would it be about the community? And Lord of the Flies put to rest forever the nature of humans, right? In terms of being self-preoccupied and self-indulgent. It was not a good commentary on human nature. Solomon says that's what we are. He says if you don't believe it, just watch your child. Proverbs 20, verse 11. He says, even small children are known by their actions. So their conduct really pure and upright. Is their conduct really pure and upright? Most parents, they want to believe my child is sweet, my child is cute, my child is innocent, and then we have a child. And we wonder, where did they get all this stuff from? Have you ever heard that term, acting out? You'll see a child who's being really wild, and someone will say, oh, they're just acting out. Well, that's exactly right. They're acting out exactly what's in here. Now, we could go into a long theological discussion about the description of human nature, about how all of us are born with this sin nature. It's a part of who we are that makes us opposed to God and everyone else. But we don't even have to go that far. Because my guess is the child that's been in your home, my guess is their first words weren't please. First words weren't thank you or how was your day? No, our children's first words were mine and no. Because a child is foolish. You don't have to teach your kid how to lie, how to blame, how to hide, how to shirk responsibility. Nobody teaches kids those things. They're there by nature. It's part of being foolish. Now, if we didn't come from this background, if we'd never been exposed to all this, imagine you're a parent, you bring a child into your home. This happened to us the other day. Bryce, our youngest, who you saw there, he's 2, almost 3, I guess. And he went and started grabbing the paper towel roll and just started pulling, Has your kid ever done this? And so Jen said, let go of the paper towel roll. And so he keeps his eyes locked on her and very slowly just keeps pulling. So she goes over and she kind of, spanks his hand. Then he walks into the middle of the family room and decides to just pee himself. To show us, right? But who taught him that? Like, where does that come from? No, none of us ever sat down and said, okay, this is what you should do when you get mad. Like, where'd that come from? Or our other son, Nathan, he went through this phase, and maybe you've had one of these, where he would just sit down wherever he was. If he didn't want to do something, down he went. I mean, this would happen in department stores, in the grocery store, in the church foyer. Just sit down, and there was no talking him out of it. The only way to keep from making an even bigger scene than he was already making was just to pick him up and carry him. And every time he'd do that, I'll be like, where did that come from? You must have got that from your mother, because that is not from me. But this is Solomon's insight about the nature of every person who's ever lived as a child. We all start with this rebelliousness. You're going to get a kick out of what Albert Siegel, a psychologist, writes about kids. He says, when it comes to rearing children, every society is about 20 years away from barbarism. 20 years is all we have to accomplish the task of civilizing the infants that were born into our midst each year. These savages, they know nothing of our language, our culture, our religion, our values, and our custom of interpersonal relations. The infant is totally ignorant about communism, fascism, democracy, civil liberties, and the rights of the minority as contrasted to the prerogatives of the majority. They are completely ignorant about respect, about decency, about honesty, about customs and conventions and manners. The barbarian must be tamed if civilization is to survive. And you read that and you say, this guy's been reading Solomon. Sounds a lot like Proverbs. Now, my plea is that this is where we start. I mean, children are a delight. They are unexposed to lots of things. They are uninitiated. There's a freshness and an aliveness to kids. But we can't miss this. You know, in England, when you get sort of too old for the normal sports like soccer and cricket and rugby and those things, a lot of times at parties and things, you'll play a game called bowls. It's a lot like bocce ball, if you've ever played that. Just like bocce ball, there's a small ball. They call it the jack. And you throw the jack out into the middle of this field or something, and then everyone else has these bigger balls. And the goal is for everyone to throw their bigger ball and try to get it as close to the jack as you can. The problem is these balls, they look like normal balls, but they're not. They are not weighted symmetrically. Inside these balls, the weight is sort of off-center. So when you throw it, if you've ever thrown a ball that's off-center, it just goes whoop, whoop. It kind of like goes all over the place. And so the point is to try to throw these balls, but you really can't really have a lot of skill at it because you have no idea where it's going to go. Because the center is off. And Solomon says in the parenting process, it is crucial to begin with the understanding that in our children, that their center is off. Then everything else can flow from there. This is why there's no guarantees in the parenting process. There's no magic formulas because every child is different. Their willingness to listen and to be corrected, their off-centeredness is different in every single one. This is what makes parenting so challenging. So what's my job then? What's our job? If our children are foolish, if they're rebellious, then what is our job? And depending what culture you're from, this varies. You know, if you're from a very sort of traditional culture, the view of parents, the job is sort of viewed as control. Authoritarian control. Maybe more modern cultures, maybe even ours today, would say, oh no, the parent's job is to be a role of affection and encouragement, affirmation. You're your kid's biggest cheerleader, their best friend. The wisdom God gives us through Solomon, it doesn't take either of those paths. It sort of charts a course between the two of them. And it says that a parent's job is to impart wisdom. It's to prevent them and to correct them. In a word, it's to discipline them. It's to move the foolishness away from them. It's guiding. It's this ongoing process of helping children to become smart about their own foolishness. And this is really important that we understand. I mean, parenting is helping a child arrive at a place where they can deal with their own foolishness. And that you as the parent don't have to. It's not primarily about what you do to a child. I mean, that's important. But at some point in the parenting process, the child has got to assume some responsibility and realize that they are a part of their own choices. And so the parenting process is a lot about prevention and correction. You know, I was fascinated when I was looking at a lot of these proverbs about parenting. Almost all of them are addressed to the child. My son, do this. My children, do that. My daughter, listen to this. They're directed at the child and not particularly at the parent. Because the goal is for the child to get smart, to get educated morally, to live in the world as it is, and not as the world as they like it to be. Prevention and correction. Let me show you this in Proverbs. Proverbs 23. Do not withhold discipline from a child. In other words, here's a child on their course. Don't not discipline them. You've got to get them off of their course. If you punish them with the rod, they will not die. Punish them with the rod and save them from death. Notice, disciplining is not something that you do to a child. It's something you do for a child. You're keeping them from pursuing a path that could lead to their own death. Physically, morally, spiritually. You know, I think most of us look at discipline this way. When I discipline my child, that I'm preventing them, and I'm in this sort of correcting mode. I'm trying to get them to do what I want them to do. And I think Solomon would say, no, that's not what discipline's about. No, discipline, it's really about keeping a child from doing what they want to do. Because their choice would probably lead to their own demise. Because they're foolish. Now, especially in today's culture, I think we all start to worry, well, wait, all this discipline, if I correct them when they're on the wrong path, if I tell them sort of how to make better decisions, aren't I going to sort of wound them in some way? Sort of hurt their self-esteem? Am I really maiming them for life? And Solomon says, no, they won't die. No, preventing and correcting them is actually a good thing. What if we don't? What would happen if we withheld our discipline? I found it interesting. A few years ago, the Houston Police Department ran sort of a billboard campaign trying to help less and less kids get into the delinquent system. And so they put up a billboard, and one of them said 12 rules for raising delinquent children. If you want delinquent children, here's what you should do. 1, begin in infancy to give a child whatever he wants. This way, he'll grow up to believe that the world owes him a living. 2, when he picks up bad words, laugh at him. This will make him think that he's cute. 3, never give him any spiritual training. Wait until he's 21, and then let him decide for himself. 4, avoid the use of the word wrong. This may develop a guilt complex. This will condition him to believe later when he's arrested for stealing a car that society is really against him. Pick up things he leaves lying around. Let him read any printed material he gets his hands on. Give him all the spending money he wants. Satisfy every craving for food, drink, and comfort that he has. Take his side against neighbors, teachers, and policemen. They're all against your child anyway. When he gets into any real trouble, apologize to yourself by saying, I could never do anything with him anyway. And last one, prepare for a life of grief, because you'll probably have one. You know, this is what the first passage we talked about sort of addressed. Remember what it said, Proverbs 22? It said, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far away. Solomon's encouragement is to use discipline to get foolishness far from him. Notice he doesn't say to eradicate it. Now, I won't ask for a show of hands, but my guess is if I would ask all of us in this room, how many times we've had to say, boy, what I was about to just do is really foolish. We've probably been in that situation. Foolishness never goes away. The goal of parenting isn't to eradicate it. You can't do that. It's going to be with us. It's part of our sin nature as long as we're alive. The goal of parenting is to help move it far, far to the back of the mind. To give it some distance so that kids will have the right voice to listen to. Look at Proverbs 13. Whoever spares the rod hates their child, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them. Isn't that an interesting interchange? You know, most parents, when forced with those in-the-moment decisions, do I take a stand or don't I? Do I sort of get into correction mode or not? Should I do some preventative work here? You know, a lot of times we're tempted to say, boys will be boys. This looks really challenging to step into. I really don't want them unhappy with me right now. And Solomon says, if you don't step in that moment, you hate your child. But if you love them, you discipline them. Now, discipline is a topic of its own in Proverbs. And we don't have time to chase it all, but I want to briefly, the discipline that we see in Proverbs, there's really 3 different categories or levels to it. And that they're all valuable and they're all necessary. The first one's pretty clear. We've already seen it referenced a couple times. It's the discipline that's physical. Corporal, sort of physical discipline. It's consequences that come when a child engages certain kinds of behavior. You've probably had this happen in your house. It's happened with all of our kids. There's a point when they're, 1, 2 years old, when they think it's pretty fun to throw food on the floor, right? Most kids go through that stage. Now, someone has to tell them that is outside the bounds of normal activity, right? And that's probably going to be you or me. And it's not going to happen through like a long discussion. You know, you're not going to sit down with your 1-year-old and have this like long logical argument about why food on the tray is better than food on the floor. No, it's going to happen with something physical. Removing the food from them. Or spanking their hand or something. Some physical means of instructing and correcting them. And that's what's really needed at that age. Because no other method is going to get through. They won't get it. Now, the book of Proverbs mentions the rod. We've already seen it several times, many times. So if you're ever wondering, is God in favor of spanking? He's in favor of spanking. Now, this isn't physical abuse. This isn't anything done in anger. But it's a method of delivering a certain amount of pain when a child's actions are going in a certain way that makes them think, I better not go that way again. That is the whole point of discipline for kids and even for us as adults, to help us say, you know, that way leads to pain. I don't want to go that way. But it would be wrong for us to think that every time Proverbs mentions the word rod, that it's referring to spanking, because really the word is like an authoritative stance. And so, yeah, sometimes that might mean some sort of physical spanking, but there's lots of other physical things. You know, and it depends on the situation, depends on the kid. Some kids, based on their temperament, just a stern look they're gonna melt down. Some kids, if you just sort of talk to them firmly, they're going to completely change their course of action. Some might need a timeout chair or some sort of isolation or take away some privilege or some freedom. These are physical things to help a child learn. My behavior got me that. And if I don't want that, then I better change my behavior. And that's the purpose of discipline. The largest category of discipline in the book of Proverbs is this sort of verbal, reasoned argument. Over and over again, you're going to see Solomon saying, my son, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. If you do that, here's what's going to happen. He paints all these pictures. Go look at the ant. Learn from them. All of these logical arguments. He's trying to help his children figure out life. And so he sort of taps into the incredible power of the brain and say, oh, if I do that, that's what's going to happen. Now, some might ask, well, when should you switch from sort of the corporal, physical kind of discipline to this verbal, reasoned argument? And I don't think there really is a sharp line in all of that. I have 2 older sisters, and so I've learned a lot from just sort of watching them parent. My oldest sister has 4 girls, and I can remember when her girls were really young. A phrase that I'd hear her say all the time is, make a good decision. They sort of see that little decision point, make a good decision. That's this verbal reasoned argument. It would happen even when the kids are really little. Think through their choices, that their choices have consequences. That's the power of this sort of reasoned arguments. The last kind of discipline is just to allow the circumstantial realities to run their course. You know, let a person's behavior result in the natural consequences. They'll figure it out. Jen's done a good job in the area of food with our kids. You know, a lot of kids, they'll look at a food and they'll say, I don't want that, right? Well, we don't often make them finish the whole thing if they hate it, but they have to at least eat half of it. So a lot of times she'll just say, well, that's the next thing you're going to eat. So you don't have to eat it now, but it's snack time. If you want a snack, guess what's coming back out? Guess what's coming out for breakfast in the morning? And eventually the natural consequence of hunger, it fixes that. They eventually get hungry enough where they'll eat anything. It's a good teacher. Almost every parent I know has at some point had to say to their kids, I'm done talking to you about locking up your bicycle. If you don't lock it up and it gets stolen, that's on you now. Or other things. I'm not going to tell you to bring your baseball glove in the house. If it gets rained on, that's on you. This is your responsibility now. So at some point, the discipline process becomes the natural consequences. There are some things we've tried to teach our kids, but there's going to be other systems that are actually going to teach it, like the school system. A teacher is going to say, you know what? That assignment was due yesterday. I'm sorry. And at some point with your children, you stop making sure they get the deadlines. You help them, but at some point that's their responsibility. Or they're going to get enough tardies where they're going to have to stay after school because you stopped making sure they woke up on time, and you just sort of let the natural consequence take its course. Here's sort of the goal of all discipline. It's involvement that results in education. That's what happens when your parents engaged in your life and in mine. Things that prevented and corrected our behavior. Now, I want us to see this back in Proverbs 23 because the tendency in all of us is to withhold it. And that's why Solomon's encouragement is, do not withhold discipline from a child. Because he knows our first inclination, yours and mine, is to say, that's too hard. Man, I don't have the energy to really engage this right now. I want them to like me. It's unpleasant. It's too difficult. Well, I'll just sort of withhold it. That's our tendency, and so his encouragement is don't do that. When you see that behavior down the wrong course, that foolishness, that's the moment to engage. That's the moment to step closer. Let me just show you this in action. Proverbs 6. He gives us sort of a run-through here of how Solomon envisions this happening. He says, my son, and remember, most of the Proverbs are addressed to the kid. He says, keep your father's command and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Now, notice this is a team effort. This is a man and a woman on the same team helping their kids make the best decisions that they can. It says, take your father's command and your mother's teaching and bind them always around your heart. Fasten them around your neck. Now, this is Hebrew poetry for putting things in the most important places. This wisdom that you get from your parents of how to make good decisions, put that in the most prominent place. And then watch what happens. When you walk, this is just a picture for everything you do in life. When you walk, when you move about, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. When you awake, they will speak to you. Right, the first thing of the day. These principles, these guidelines, this wisdom that you've gained from your parents, it will speak to you. For this command is a lamp, this teaching is a light, and correction and instruction are a way to life. Solomon would say it this way in chapter 1. He says, listen, my son, to your father's instruction. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. They are a garland of grace to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck. This wisdom is a piece of adornment that you wear out in public. This is the goal. These little savages that come into our houses. Our job as a parent is to get them ready to go out into life, where wisdom is like a chain around their neck. Your job and my job is to get kids ready to go out there. And there are so many things that they need to learn, and we're the only ones in the spot to teach them. To teach them it's better to be courteous than it is to be rude. It's better to have humility than arrogance. That honesty is the best policy. That people prefer to be around someone who listens and not who just talks all the time. That life's really about serving and not being served. That there are limits to a person's behavior. That it's important to be on time. It's crucial to find a way to work through a disagreement, to come to some sort of resolution. That there are appropriate and inappropriate ways to relate to the opposite sex. People should finish what they start. They should tell the truth. They should not cover up their mistakes, and they should work for excellence. Nobody's going to teach those things to our kids unless we do. Now, there's one last thing I want to talk about before we finish, and that is that Proverbs actually indicates some ideas about the approach of how we go about doing this preventing and correcting work. And I want to leave you with two words to kind of think about. One is the word relationship, deep, committed, sort of soul bondedness from parent to child. And the other is the word example, what we might think of as a role model, something like that. Solomon's going to hit on both of these for someone who's doing this disciplining, preventing, correcting work in the life of a rebel. From Proverbs 4:3, he says, "For I too was a son to my father, still tender," meaning teachable, reachable, "and cherished by my mother, then he taught me." This is Solomon looking back at when he was a kid. And he says, you know what was this? I had this connection with my parents from my earliest days. They were deeply bonded to me. They cherished me. They were on my team. They were eager to build into my life. I wasn't a project to them. I was a person of great worth, of great value. I was their son. You know, it's fascinating. Most people today are asking the question, what can I do to raise good children? I think Solomon's answer would be in their lives. Not tangentially in their lives, but in their lives. You know, they did a survey of 2,500 fifth graders out at UCLA. And they asked them, what's your greatest frustration with your parents? 2,500 fifth graders. And their response was not enough time. Not enough time. Solomon would say, man, I knew my parents. They were connected to me. You know, I do far too much over-the-shoulder parenting. Do you know what you do this too? Where you're sort of engaged over here and sort of involved over here, and you're sort of parenting like that, over the shoulder at what's going on over here. And a question I just ask all of us is, when was the last time we just looked in our kids' eyes, sort of got down on their level, sort of did something that they wanted to do? I think that's what Solomon would say, is that this relational piece is a huge piece of our approach. The second thing he talks about is this model to our approach. In chapter 4:11, now he's not talking about his relationship with his parents. Now he's talking about his relationship with his kids. And this is what he says. He says, I instruct you in the way of wisdom. I lead you along straight paths. Now that word paths, if you look at it, it's the word that has to do with what a wagon does when it goes over the same path over and over and over again. It's a wagon's furrow, those little ditches that get in the road from the wheel. Because that wagon has gone over that path so many times, it's really clear and easy for everyone to see where it's been. That's what Solomon's saying. He's saying, I showed you how to live. I didn't just tell you where to go. I took you to where I've already been. I've lived the kind of life I'm teaching you to live. Where I've made God a priority, where I've made integrity an issue. I've made a big deal about relationships. You know, kids can smell a phony from a mile away. Solomon says it takes a real person to be a parent. I don't know about you, but sometimes I get tired of all the blogs and all the podcasts and all the books. You go into a bookstore and you look in the parenting section, you're going to see, 20 feet long of parenting books. And I don't know, if you ever wondered, are they doing any better raising their kids than I'm doing? I think the reality is that even the experts, they're doing about just as good a job as the rest of us. Proverbs is this real book. There's no guarantees. It's about parents preventing and correcting, disciplining these rebels, and being emotionally, relationally connected to them, and living out an example in front of them. So here's sort of the three things today that Solomon would say, wisdom on parenting. You can go to the next slide. Now, parenting is a high calling. I don't know what you're feeling right now. It's really too high. It's too high for us. None of us can consistently provide these things for our children. So I think there'd be sort of two final words of encouragement. One is that these children are on loan to us. They're not ultimately our responsibility. These are really God's kids who he's said, you know what? I'm going to allow you to steward these gifts. And so this is what he wants for our kids even more than we want. And so he's going to help us to that end. Second is that the Spirit lives inside those of us who've trusted Jesus Christ. And so the Spirit can energize us to do what we would not be able to do in our own strength. So I think parenting is really a daily process of saying, not by might nor by power, but by your Spirit. That is how I'm going to love and correct and discipline these savages. So let me pray to us to this end.